Even now, Erwin Rommel remains one of the most instantly recognizable commanders of the Second World War, still remembered as the Desert Fox, the bold armored leader who seemed to move faster than the map could explain. But the real weight of Rommel's legacy isn't only found in his battlefield nerve. It lies in something far rarer inside Hitler's Germany: the willingness to tell Adolf Hitler the truth, when the truth was the last thing Hitler wanted to hear. Rommel's own son, Manfred, watched that relationship up close, watched the admiration turn into dread, and watched his father discover that honesty in a dictatorship can be treated as a crime worthy of death. In the beginning, there were few visible cracks. Rommel was a decorated veteran of the First World War, a man whose reputation had been built on discipline, nerve, and a soldier's pride. When Germany's armed forces were reduced and restricted after the Great War, he chose to stay in uniform anyway, first shaping young men as an instructor, later rising through the ranks as the political atmosphere of Germany transformed. In the mid-1930s, Rommel was even pulled into the regime's ceremonial world, serving as a military escort during the annual Nuremberg rally. From the outside, it looked like the story of a professional officer adapting to his country's new leadership. Step by step, captain, major, colonel, always moving upward, always in motion. Then the road narrowed toward war. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland, and Europe fell into the conflict that would become global. Rommel's skill set, fast movement, decisive action, armored leadership fit the new style of warfare Hitler admired. In 1940, Hitler gave him command of the 7th Panzer Division, a formation that would become famous for speed, surprise, and chaos. Rommel drove through France with such aggressive tempo that even friendly headquarters sometimes lost track of where he was. By the time his panzers reached the English Channel, his name carried a new electricity. In February of 1941, he was promoted to Lieutenant General, and soon after came the assignment that would fuse his image with legend. North Africa was supposed to be a sideshow. Rommel turned it into theatre. Hitler sent him to the desert with 2 panzer divisions and a mission to stabilize a collapsing position against the British. Before he left, he met Hitler again, still the relationship of superior and subordinate, still the sense that the regime's leader was untouchable. Rommel, confident to the point of arrogance, walked into Africa believing he could bend the battlefield to his will. The nickname Desert Fox, coined with respect by his enemies, followed him like a shadow that grew larger with every daring maneuver. At home, his wife Lucy and their only child, Manfred, born in 1928, lived under that shadow too, watching the war pull their family into a future they could not control. Rommel led the way he believed a commander should, close to the front, visible to his troops, hungry to fight from the edge of risk. That style inspired loyalty. Soldiers saw their field marshal in the dust and heat, not behind a desk. But it also fed the myth, and Hitler's propaganda machine knew exactly what to do with myth. Joseph Goebbels pushed Rommel's image into the public eye, a photogenic hero, well-spoken, decisive, a symbol the regime could sell to the German people as proof that victory was inevitable. For a time, the formula worked. Rommel's early successes earned him unusual freedom. Orders came from Berlin. If he disliked them, he sometimes tore them up and acted on instinct. The British, reading intercepted German messages, were baffled when Rommel refused to behave the way their intelligence predicted. He became to his opponents not only dangerous but unpredictable, a commander who didn't always follow the script. Yet the desert was also exposing the limits of Germany's power. Behind Rommel's daring was a quiet, brutal arithmetic: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, replacement men. As 1942 unfolded, the balance began to shift. Britain's supply situation improved. American industrial power entered the war, and the pressure in North Africa thickened like heat. Rommel's headquarters sent urgent requests to German leadership: more tanks, more aircraft support, more everything. Too often the response was silence, delay, or token shipments that couldn't change the outcome. It started to feel to Rommel like abandonment. While he was being praised as a hero, his army was being starved. And the more his position worsened, the more his body began to break under the strain: insomnia, depression, headaches, low blood pressure, jaundice. The legend was exhausted, and the desert was swallowing him. The collapse came in stages and humiliations. Rommel fought hard, retreated when he had to, and watched the Allies grind forward with overwhelming material advantage. Eventually, North Africa was lost. In May of 1943, about 130,000 Germans and Italians surrendered, ending the Axis fight there. Rommel returned to Germany carrying something heavier than defeat: the feeling that his men had been sacrificed for a war Hitler had stopped thinking about realistically. When Rommel went to speak to Hitler, he did not come as a politician. He came as a soldier, delivering an honest assessment. Africa was untenable. The situation could not be repaired under the conditions he had been forced to fight in. Hitler's reaction was not gratitude for truth, it was contempt. He mocked Rommel's focus, demanded crude numbers, treated him like a subordinate who had failed not because he lacked supplies, but because he lacked faith. The exchange left Rommel shaken, not because he feared Hitler's temper, many officers had seen that, but because he began to understand what Hitler's temper represented. A reality in which facts were treason if they did not flatter the leader's will. Around this period, darker knowledge seeped into Rommel's awareness. Rumors from the Eastern Front grew louder: executions, mass murder, prisoners of war and civilians treated like disposable objects, the machinery of extermination hidden beneath official language. It was not that Germany suddenly became cruel in 1943. Cruelty had been there from the start. But for many in uniform, the scale and specificity came into focus later, piece by piece, carried by whispers, letters, and wounded men. For Rommel, the war began to feel less like a national struggle and more like Hitler's personal obsession Germany harnessed to preserve one man's power, not Germany's future. The charm Hitler used in private meetings could still temporarily disarm doubt, but the doubt kept returning stronger. Rommel wanted another command Italy, perhaps something that felt like a purposeful fight rather than a slow collapse. Instead, he was given a role that would place him at the heart of the war's next catastrophe: the defense of Western Europe. After Stalingrad's disaster and the Soviet advance, everyone in the German High Command understood that a second front in the West was coming. Rommel had fought the British and Americans before. He respected their capabilities and understood their methods. Hitler placed him in charge of the coastal defenses, tied to the grand concept Hitler loved to brag about: the Atlantic Wall, supposedly stretching from Norway to the Spanish border, supposedly a fortress line that would break any invasion. When Rommel inspected what he had been given, he found the truth. The Atlantic Wall existed more in Hitler's imagination than in concrete and steel. There were fortifications, yes, but not enough, not deep enough, and not organized to meet the kind of assault Rommel believed was inevitable. Rommel argued that Germany had one chance in the West: stop the Allies at the shoreline in the first day at the waterline, in the first hours before air power and naval guns could build an unstoppable bridgehead. Other senior commanders favored a mobile defense, pulling armor back for a decisive counterattack inland. Rommel feared that was fantasy. The Allies dominated the skies. Armored movement in daylight would be punished, pinned, destroyed. His logic was simple and frightening. If the Allies got ashore, the war in the West was essentially lost. So Rommel did what he always did. He worked like a man chasing time. He pushed mines, obstacles, beach stakes, bunkers, trenches, gun nests. He sketched designs, demanded results, drove across France to inspect compliance, turned sleepy commands into frantic construction sites. He added battle-hardened units where he could, including the 352nd Infantry Division on the Normandy coast. He trained troops relentlessly, digging, building, drilling, repeating. To those who watched him, he was less a glamorous fox now and more a manager of desperation, trying to build a fortress out of shortages. He did not believe it would guarantee victory. He believed it might buy time, and time was the only currency Germany was running out of fastest. By late spring of 1944, Rommel's urgency sharpened into dread. He had studied Allied landings in North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, and he knew they depended on weather windows. The English Channel in June could be savage: wind, rain, unpredictable swells. The Germans expected bad weather to delay any major landing, but Allied meteorologists saw what German forecasters missed: a short break in the storm cycle, a thin opening the invaders could exploit. And while German leadership argued and guessed, Dwight D. Eisenhower made the decision that would change the world. Go. On the morning of June 6, 1944, Allied forces hit Normandy, thousands of ships, waves of aircraft, troops pouring toward the coast. And the man responsible for the Atlantic Wall was not at his headquarters in France. Rommel had returned to Germany, partly to see his wife on her milestone birthday, partly to confront Hitler again, one more attempt to force the dictator to face reality. The timing was catastrophic. In Germany, the phone rang, and the invasion broadcast cut through the air like a siren. Manfred, home as a teenage flak helper, later described what it felt like to be among the first Germans to understand the invasion had begun. and to watch his father react anger, pain, urgency, and a frustration that bordered on helplessness because he was not where he believed he needed to be. Rommel left by car as fast as roads and chaos allowed. He reached his headquarters late that night, returning to a situation already slipping beyond German control. Some officers still clung to the idea that Normandy was a diversion and the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais. Allied deception, Operation Fortitude, had done its job so well that German forces remained fixed in the wrong place, waiting for a second blow that never came. Meanwhile, Allied air power and naval guns hammered roads, bridges, and movement routes exactly as Rommel had feared. The counterattack that might have thrown the invaders back into the sea was delayed, fragmented, and strangled by the sky. A day after the landings, Rommel went to see the front himself. He saw the scale of the Allied foothold, the constant flow of men and equipment, the way air dominance turned German movement into a death sentence. Even if German soldiers fought with courage, the math was merciless. Within a week of D-Day, Rommel understood that the war in Western Europe was lost unless Germany did something Hitler could not mentally accept: negotiate. On June 15, 1944, Rommel met Hitler to discuss Normandy. Rommel's blunt assessment was not welcomed. He argued that a truce in the West was the only way to spare Germany annihilation and to concentrate defenses against the Soviet advance. Hitler's response revealed the trap Germany was in. He admitted, in essence, that no one would negotiate with him, and he also made clear he would not step aside. The war was no longer being fought for Germany's future. It was being fought to preserve Hitler from the consequences of his own choices. Rommel began to articulate an idea that, inside the Third Reich, sounded like heresy. If Hitler could not secure peace, then Hitler had to be removed from power, not necessarily assassinated, but pushed aside so Germany could surrender to the Western Allies and avoid total destruction. Rommel believed his oath and his sense of lawful order mattered. He was not comfortable with murder as political method. To him there was a difference between arrest and assassination, between a legal removal and an illegal act. And yet, even as he rejected the idea of killing Hitler, he listened to officers who believed assassination was the only door left. That tension between loyalty to a concept of Germany and disgust with Hitler's Germany tightened around him like wire. By mid-July, Rommel did something that made his position even more dangerous. He put his assessment into writing. On July 15, 1944, he sent a blunt letter to Hitler, arguing that the war in the West was effectively lost and that Germany must seek peace. It was not simply a complaint, it was a warning and an indictment, a soldier telling the head of state that continuing the fight would destroy the nation. In a normal government, such honesty might be valued. Under Hitler, it was indistinguishable from betrayal. 2 days later, fate struck with a violence that felt almost symbolic. On July 17, 1944, Rommel's staff car was attacked by Allied aircraft near a French town on the route from a conference back toward his headquarters. The vehicle crashed off the road. Rommel, sitting forward, was thrown hard into the frame, his face smashed, his skull fractured, an injury severe enough that many assumed he would die quickly. He did not die that night. But his active military command did. The Desert Fox was removed from the battlefield, not by a courtroom or a demotion, but by a sudden burst of fire from the sky. He survived, alert and aware, yet physically broken and now politically exposed. Only days after his injury came the attempt on Hitler's life at the Wolf's Lair on July 20th, 1944, an explosion meant to end the regime in one strike. It failed. The aftermath was ruthless. Thousands were tried and executed, many of them swept up not because they were central to the plot, but because Hitler wanted a wider purge. The failure gave him an excuse to eliminate anyone who looked insufficiently loyal. Rommel's name became useful in that climate, not necessarily because he had planted a bomb, but because he had committed the unforgivable act of speaking defeat out loud. To Hitler, acknowledging reality was treason. As Rommel recovered at home in Germany, the net tightened. Gestapo interrogations, whispered accusations, guilt by association. Hitler did not want Rommel in a public courtroom. A public trial would turn Rommel into a symbol, either a martyr or a stage for uncomfortable truths. The regime preferred quieter outcomes. And so, on the morning of October 14, 1944, Rommel woke without knowing it would be his last day alive. Around midday, 2 generals arrived, carrying the weight of the state in their uniforms and the cold certainty of a decision already made. Rommel was informed that a tribunal had concluded he was guilty of acting against Hitler and the interests of the fatherland. Then came the choice that was not a choice. If he took poison cyanide, his family would be spared. His wife Lucy and his son Manfred would not be punished. He would receive a state funeral, and the regime would publicly preserve the myth. The great field marshal as loyal hero, dead honorably, with no mention of disgrace. The alternative was to refuse, to demand a legal defense, and be dragged before the People's Court, a theater of humiliation that almost always ended in a death sentence, often followed by punishment for the family. Rommel understood what the regime was offering him, a final bargain, designed to protect Hitler's image as much as to protect Rommel's family. He spoke to Lucy with brutal simplicity, telling her that within minutes he would be dead, that the poison had been brought, and that this was the price he was paying for telling Hitler the truth. He spoke to Manfred, urging him to be strong, to support his mother, to endure what was coming. Then Rommel entered the car with the officers. It drove a short distance. The car stopped. The men stepped away. Rommel took the poison. When they returned, he was already collapsing, gasping, losing consciousness, dying fast. Within minutes, it was over. The regime delivered what it promised on the surface: a state funeral, solemn speeches, controlled narrative. At one point, a senior officer was made to declare words drafted by propaganda phrases, insisting Rommel's heart belonged to Hitler, the kind of statement that insulted anyone who knew the truth. But the spectacle served its purpose. Hitler had eliminated one of the few men with the stature to challenge him publicly, while preserving the illusion that the hero had died loyal and untroubled. Hitler would continue driving Germany toward ruin. He would not accept peace. He would not step aside. And months later, on April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler would kill himself in his bunker as the war closed in on Berlin. By then, millions had died who did not need to die, and the map of Europe had been carved by a catastrophe that could no longer be undone. In the end, Rommel's bleak predictions proved correct, not because he was a saint, not because he was free of moral blindness, but because he understood, earlier than most, that a war led by fantasy and ego ends only one way. Rommel's story remains unsettling because it refuses to stay simple. He was a brilliant commander and a man shaped by the military culture he served. He was courageous, admired by troops, respected even by enemies, and used by propaganda as a symbol of German strength. He also served a regime that committed monstrous crimes, and for too long he remained strategically blind to what that regime truly was. But when the battlefield truth became undeniable, when he saw Germany being sacrificed to Hitler's refusal to face reality, Rommel did what few dared. He spoke plainly to the dictator, pressed for an end, urged peace, and accepted the personal danger that followed. His final hours show what that danger meant inside Hitler's Germany. Not debate, not resignation, not retirement poison in a small vial, delivered by men in uniform, with a funeral arranged before the body was cold. That is why the Desert Fox is still remembered, not only for his daring in the desert, but for the moment he stepped out of the safe language of loyalty and into the deadly territory of truth, where, in a dictatorship, even honesty can be prosecuted as treason, and a national hero can be given a choice that is really an execution with paperwork.